You're listening to Chicago Stories, a podcast from City Hall featuring the stories of everyday Chicagoans, as told to Mayor Rahm Emanuel.
This is Mayor Rahm Emanuel, Chicago Stories. We're joined by Dr. B. Herbert Martin, head of the pastoring over at the Progressive Community Church in Bronzeville community, the historic Bronzeville community.
Right.
Did I get everything right there?
You got it right.
Outside of you, everybody should join and go to your sermons, which are perfect.
That'd be great. And just recently, I was elected president of the Council of Religious Leaders of Metropolitan Chicago.
Well, I did not know that. Congratulations.
Yes, thank you.
Now you're like the dog that caught the car. You not just have your congregation, you got to get everybody else's faith all working together.
Indeed so.
Well, I want to thank you for being here because this is an important anniversary. And the anniversary being obviously 50 years and an inflection point, the assassination of Dr. King, but also how he changed the trajectory, not just of the country, our city also. And you've been leading up that effort, if I'm not mistaken, to think through as a city how we pay tribute to that. But before we get there, tell me a little about your church, because we came up to the 100-year anniversary, the role of the Progressive Community Church in Bronzeville, and how do you think that anniversary and the one with Dr. King, how do we best service?
Very, very significant histories, because Progressive is what is called a first migration congregation, and that grew out of the colored Methodist Episcopal Church in those days back in the 1920s. And bought the facility where we are in Bronzeville now in 1922 from Ratfi Zedek congregation, which was a Jewish congregation.
I don't think I knew that.
We thought the Jews had built that building, but come to find out when we looked at the cornerstone, it was built by a Baptist church in 1895.
That building can't keep a faith for nothing.
And so Progressive has always been what is called a community church. So we're not governed by a hierarchy, so to speak. And so we're free to determine our destiny and the way in which we develop our outreach ministries, our liturgies, our theologies, and so forth. So we become a community church, which makes us open then to a large part of political and activist activity. So we've been there all those years. So men like William Dawson has come through our place, and some of the early political leadership of the city, aldermen, and then eventually Mayor Harold Washington, came out of our congregation as well.
Was he a good member of the congregation?
Very faithful.
Very faithful.
I put faithful, not so much good.
Well, with that, I could have gotten an A in your class, too.
Very good. And so we've been an activist congregation, so it was easy for us to get involved with Martin Luther King when he came to Chicago in 1966 to do his demonstration of fair housing and so forth. As a matter of fact, some of his strategy sessions were held in that building in August of 1966. Personalities like A. Philip Randolph have come through there, Ralph Metcalf, you name them. They've all been through that place.
It's interesting. So the Progressive Community Churches where Dr. King was at, not at a Baptist place of worship. Well, I suppose you could say, since you told me this cornerstone was, he was just going back to its histories as a place of Baptist faith.
And there were just a few of the churches that were open, to him coming, and the pastors receptive to him coming.
That is a part of Chicago history people forget. In fact, the good portion of the religious community and leadership did not want him in Chicago.
As a matter of fact, one pastor resented his presence so much so that when South Park was renamed Martin Luther King Drive, he changed the address of his church.
I was just recently at Stone Temple on the west side.
Oh, yeah, Dr. Stone.
Yeah, where Dr. King preached at and ministered at. And we're working with the church and helping. We've made it a historic landmark, helping it on resources to rebuild, to make sure that the history is told retold in the mission.
Indeed, so the Stone Temple is a very historic place, and where Dr. King, the West Side reception, was at Stone Temple, and with Shelvin Hall and Art Griffin, some of Vance Henry's, colleagues. Also, now on the South Side, it would have been Liberty Progressive Baptist Church, right there at 49th and King Drive, where he also spoke. And then some of the strategies sessions held at Progressive Community Church, and with what was in those days called the Packing House Workers Hall, which is the black union.
Right. That was the meat packers.
The Amalgamated Meat Packers Union. That's
where
right.
Charlie Hayes came out of.
Charlie Hayes, Addie Wyatt, all those.
So much has been said of, I want to get to this, and then I want to get a little to your personal background, because you're from Mississippi.
Yes, indeed.
And you're part of that second generation of the migration. But Dr. King's comments about Chicago, he had seen stuff he said he'd never seen before. The violence, the response to his message. This is later on in his civil rights movement. What did you think he saw, and why did he pick Chicago to make his march up north from the South? Why fair housing? Why Chicago? And when he walked away, did he come away disillusioned, hopeful? And what's the lessons for us as a city today, given that we're still dealing with the issue of equitable housing?
Right.
And that's like 7 questions, so you just go ahead and take the next 3 minutes and try to figure it out.
What I would say is that in terms of comparing his experience out in Marquette Park with what he had experienced in the South, and if he was comparing himself to what he experienced in Mississippi, and saying that the hatred and the vitriol that he experienced there was worse than what he had experienced in Mississippi, or in Georgia, or in Alabama, that is a major statement. Because Chicago had become known nationally as the largest, most racially segregated city in the nation. And housing patterns was one way by which they maintained that segregated pattern. Because in those days, I was within NAACP, and of course we had this whole housing, initiative, and what we were saying is that if you really had desegregated housing, then you would solve the problem of desegregating the schools. But of course, in those days, you had places like the Southwest Side, which is, you remember, you're probably too young to remember Father Lawler.
That is true.
Well, the Southwest Side, this is when King came. What was going on in those days?
I was at Marquette Park.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to have to give you a little family history.
Let me tell you something. Well, then, do you remember a group this is Bogan, and we were dealing with Bogan High School in those days in terms of desegregating that place. You remember a group called the Bogan Broads? This was a group of women from the Bogan PTA. I mean, boy, they were
tough.
They were monsters. So it's that kind of a vitriol and mean-spiritedness that King had experienced out there in Market Park. So his statement that Chicago, his experience here was worse than what he had seen in other places around the country, was a pretty sad commentary on the state of affairs in Chicago. Now, did he leave hopeless?
Yeah.
I don't think he did, because he was born into this tradition of hope. If you lose hope, then you lost everything. And so the whole nonviolent demonstration, the whole process, everything that he did was grounded in a hope that not only Chicago, but this country and the conscience of this country will be touched in such a way that change was inevitable. And so subsequent to all the things that has happened since then, we see some progress. We see some.
This is my amateur reading of Taylor Branch and a lot of others.
Yeah.
Is that starting around 64, 65, after the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, etc., Dr. King, and I think why Chicago is seminal, it was happening beforehand but kind of clicked, he starts to merge civil rights and economic rights. And Chicago, because of the housing and what he saw, he realized that civil rights was not enough to really deal with the complexity of the set of issues and what he saw in Chicago and felt in Chicago. This is just an amateur read of it. I'm sure there's going to be an expert that reads it and says the mayor doesn't know nothing about what he's talking about. But his message, which is in Memphis, which is more economics than civil or political, and he sees the wall here in Chicago because of housing, which had all, as you said, there's educational disparities, economic job disparities, that the civil rights had boundaries that didn't get to the raw nut of what we had to deal with. And I don't know if that's
with you.
true.
Your reading of it, you may think it's amateurish, but it's not. It's real.
You think I can get past your master thesis class?
Yes. You see, because the economic issue. See, we had gained access to public accommodations, and so forth and so on, with the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Bill. And then we also had gained, a great advantage with the 1965 Voting Rights Bill. And we were making some progress with the affordable housing, with GATRO in 1968 and so forth. But what was the problem was money, bottom line, economics, jobs, employment. We had access to ride the buses, to go to the swimming pools, go to the hotels, but we didn't have the money to pay the costs. So then you heard him begin to emphasize very strongly the economic aspect of it. His whole push for the poor people's campaign, this is against anti-poverty and so forth and so on. Around that same time, too, if you can remember, Otto Kerner had headed this Civil Rights Commission, and one part of that report dealt primarily with the lack of economic empowerment. And so King had begun to focus very clearly on the necessity of the economy, money, jobs, employment. As a matter of fact, in Memphis, the march, as you just alluded to, was about jobs, as well as human dignity, of course, and equality. So to this day, we may be free, we have access to all these wonderful places, but we do not have economic equality. And I think that's the piece that we got to work at to really make happen. In Chicago, around the country, we got to make that happen. That's the part of the three-legged stool that's not in place yet.
So, there is a piece of that, which is how do you make sure that there's an equality of opportunity and everybody has the tools to actually access that? And I do think that you can vote, you can get on a bus, you can go to a beach, which people forget here in Chicago, wasn't equitable access. But then how do you make sure people have the resources? And at the end of the day, it's about jobs and education. And if you don't do that.
And I'm thinking, the whole question about equality, unless I am able to pay my own way, to buy my own house, to buy my own whatever, then that keeps me in a position of inequality. I'm not equal. I'm not negotiating from the standpoint of power and control of my own destiny in this nation, in capitalist America. So,
Dr. This may be too painful, but where were you when you heard the news out of Memphis?
I was working in the near north side at a hotel, at a YMCA called Isham YMCA, and I was working with a social service agency called Methodist Youth Services, which worked with boys in trouble with the law, social case work, when I heard the word toward the end of that day. And of course, I'm at North and Clybourne then, and everything had gone haywire. Public transportation was halted. There was no way for me to get back to 63rd and Troop
oh my God,
in Inglewood. So I've had to wind up spending the night on the street, along with the tanks and guns and soldiers and all that stuff out there on the north side.
Do you remember how you felt?
It was a feeling of vacuousness, hopelessness. It was there. And then you had this unresolved anger as well, because it was the height of the Black Power movement as well, of which I was very much a part of. Both the South Side and the West Side was burning, on that fateful day. I was concerned about my wife and baby, of course, that was still in Inglewood, which was also in turmoil. Then the day after is what it was. After you're finding your way back to the South Side from the North Side, you're seeing the smoldering embers of these buildings and all the windows busted out. Just total devastation that was going on. And then, of course, my little group of militant watchmen, I call them. In those days, I was a part of a group called the Militant Watchmen of the Cross.
You got one for titles, man.
So anyway, we pulled ourselves together, and with the Black Power movement, the Black Panthers, of course, was very visible and very present in those days, and the work that they were doing mainly on the West Side, because Mark and Fred had not been killed by then. But you can also imagine what law enforcement was like for our community. I mean, we were under martial law in terms of our movement and our meetings and so forth and so on. So it is painful to remember that. I think the greatest pain was that we had lost a mentor at a national level, at an international level.
Without a doubt.
Yeah, we had lost a lot of direction. And with the unresolved anger that was continuing to build in the community, I was also pastoring the only Black Methodist church in Evanston. All right, I was like student pastor. I was at Garrett Seminary, but pastoring that church. And because of my closeness with members of SDS, is it safe just to talk about some of this stuff?
Sure. Yeah, your file's closed at the FBI. It's totally cool, man. They've actually put your file away. You have nothing to worry about. It's all safe.
Okay, because of this, the student movement that was happening at Northwestern, and I'm right next door to Northwestern in the theological school. So we mixed and we became friends, and SDS was very much present on the campus of Northwestern.
Sure it was.
All right. I'm not sure if your mom and dad would remember a woman by the name of Lucy Montgomery. You know Lucy Montgomery?
And her husband, up in Northwestern.
Up in Northwestern.
In Evanston, rather.
Precisely.
Yeah.
So all this nice, radical type, people. And retired.
There's somebody, Lucy's may get mad at me, but there's always referred to as limousine liberals and Mercedes Marxists.
That whole North Shore, that whole North Shore.
Not the whole North Shore, Evanston. And then he branched out.
Well, in Evanston, this is what happened. Since I had this church there in Evanston, and I was tied into the folk, the day that Mayor Daley issued the shoot to kill, all right, for the riot that broke out, when Sheriff Elrod really was lunging and broke his neck, all this stuff. Okay, so I went on back to Evanston because I had my housing in Evanston. By this time in '68, I had relocated to Evanston. So I headed back to Evanston, and the kids who knew me running from Hanrahan and his deputies, they all followed me to Evanston. All right? So, and they were coming in.
Let me guess, you hid him in the basement of the church.
Yes, indeed.
I knew where this story was going. As soon as you said that you were ministering, I knew exactly where this was going.
And I convinced the other Methodist ministers to take them in. All right, because it was chilly and cold out and kind of damp and rainy, and so the next night, because they're organizing and LSD and pot and everything else was big.
I know, for the record, I know nothing about that. Okay.
And so they were smoking up in the churches and so forth, hand in hand. And the sheriff's deputies,
the church was the first medicinal marijuana dispenser. Was your church?
We're the forerunners.
Okay.
But anyway, Henry came in, knocked our doors in,
Up in Evanston?
Yes. Broke out our windows, took the kids, and gave each one of the pastors a subpoena to grand jury for aiding and abetting fugitives from the law. That was kind of like my real baptism into politics in this area.
That's it. Oh.
Yeah.
So what was your road to ministering? Was your father or mother?
No.
Okay. So
as far as my family is concerned, I'm a renegade.
How many siblings do we have? So give me the 10 siblings. Where are you?
I'm number 3.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm number 3. But now I'm the oldest because the 2 older brothers are deceased. And I'm now the patriarch of my clan. Yeah.
And you're a renegade? Nobody else went into ministry?
And no one else wanted to be a preacher. They didn't that much want to go to church.
Were you grew up in a family pretty
very strong
Baptist, Methodist? If none of my business.
It's always no. Really, I have all of that. Pentecostal background,
Really?
Methodist background, Baptist background. I'm also, as well as an ordained Methodist minister, I'm an ordained Baptist minister. Yes, I carry these 2 portfolios.
Well, since I refer to you as rabbi, you've also got a third hat here. All right, that's really, so you got both Methodist and Baptist.
And Pentecostal.
So what led you, though, if nobody else in the family was there, why did you, son number 3?
My love for the pastor, the Methodist pastor, who was very open, very involved in the community, loved children, and had the audacity to say to me one day, "You're going to be a preacher, boy."
He did?
Yeah.
And that just clicked?
It clicked with me, and then I began to follow orators like Dr. T.R.M. Howard. You may not have heard of these guys. These are like my mentors. Dr. T.R.M. Howard was the president of the Mississippi State chapter of the NAACP. I was taken in and nurtured by them. These were men that surrounded King in his early beginnings in the early 1950s, especially after the 1954 Brown versus the Board of Education piece with Thurgood Marshall and all those. They would all come to my hometown once a year for this huge rally. I mean, in the thousands they would gather to organize, dealing with racial discrimination and so forth and so on, segregation. And listening to these great orators, some from the north, some from the east, west, they were all over the place. Boy, and we used to get little orange crates and sit and just listen for hours to all these great conversations and stuff. So I think I got touched like that into the movement. And the black church, of course, I would say the NAACP was like the outreach ministry of the black church.
Yeah?
Yeah, that's what it was. Even in Mississippi, even when the Klan was pressing so hard against the NAACP, those little black churches would meet, the deacon board would meet, call the deacons meeting in order, and then join the deacon meeting and call the NAACP meeting in order.
Simultaneously.
We had to meet that way. If it's a Masonic
because
meeting,
if the Klan found out the NAACP,
they would burn our churches, which many of them did get burned in those days. Just so happened that since my town was all black owned, we built our own institutions, our own churches, our own everything.
How many people live in the town?
In those days, about 5,000 of us. All right, and we was like a sanctuary city for folks running from the law.
You can't, people that can't see it, don't. You've been running in sanctuary church, sanctuary cities. Yeah, you're the first welcoming city in existence.
We've done it because we had to have it because men like Fred Shuttlesworth, when we were organizing SCLC and shortly after the Montgomery bus boycott was successful, the Klan didn't stop, and so they needed places to meet, and so my own bayou, Mississippi, became the meeting place for much of the leadership. Thurgood Marshall came, Martin Luther King came, those men who surrounded and nurtured him were there, like Howard Thurman, like Mays, Benjamin Elijah Mays, the founder of Morehouse, would gather in that place, that little place where the black intelligentsia, in quotes, would come to meet. Yeah.
Did you Did you see yourself then always being not just a minister, but an activist minister? Is that so?
Yes.
That it could just the walls of the church were not big enough for you?
It should not ever be.
I'm saying that complimentary.
No. You're saying it very right. There has to be a balance between our theology and our active living that theology out. If we say we believe in Jesus Christ, right, then we believe what Jesus taught us. So the Sermon on the Mount has to become a lifestyle. And you have to live that out the next 6 days after Sunday. We knew that racial superiority and that white supremacy, according to God's word, was just wrong. And therefore the strive for justice and righteousness to exist in the land, you had to get involved with the political arena, if not become a politician, at least understand politics, you see.
My mother will be upset because, she was very involved in CORE here in Chicago.
CORE?
Yeah.
Really?
My mother in late, let's say 58 to 63.
That was one of the earlier organizations.
My mother was, depending on, there's a great Yiddish word called midrash, which is like,
midrash, yes.
So midrash has it that she ran CORE in Chicago. I'm not so sure I'd go that far, but she was in the leadership of CORE. And she did the open beaches here in Chicago and the integration of the beaches here.
Well, she was perhaps...
So if I didn't ask you about CORE and your involvement, my mother would say you didn't do a good interview. So this is on Passover, a check mark for Marcia Emanuel.
Well, we'll tell her CORE was the first real civil rights organization in this nation. And I think...
No, she'll tell you and I that, but we don't have to tell her that.
Okay.
You've not run into Mom.
Yeah.
No, so did you have any interaction with CORE and its work here?
Farmer.
Yeah.
Yes, I did. See, SNCC was my main...
Your main political entity?
With Stokely Carmichael and crew. But CORE and SNCC and SCLC and all those earlier groups, yeah.
Has anybody ever convinced you that maybe what we need is a book from you? I know an agent or two if you need contacts or something. I do think you should write a book. It's essential actually for not legacy purposes, for future purposes.
So you know someone who...
I'm not usually into giving homework assignments. But Dr. Martin...
I think what it is, now that I'm coming toward the end of a long-term pastorate, there will be time to do that kind of reflection and thinking and writing and so forth.
Can I, as your friend, not your mayor, but I'll take 10% mayor, 90% friend, I think it's essential you write a book. You've seen too much, heard too much, to not give some learning to some other folks.
Thank you.
I think that would be an important contribution to the political and intellectual fabric of our city.
Thank you. I would take that under serious consideration. And
then I can invite you back as an author, not just as a pastor. That'd be cool.
There is much to be reported. I'd say that.
So tell me how you met Harold Washington, and how did you... I'm going to give you one insight on my seat.
Okay.
You know that these are lonely jobs.
Oh, yeah.
And a spiritual counselor or counselors is key to your own personal and spiritual balance. I don't think a person can do these jobs without it.
My mentor, who was also believed in religious activism, raised me up in it. He knew Harold coming. So he asked me, as he grew older, to be responsible for all the community engagement stuff, you guys call it these days. And Harold just happened to be the state representative in those days. And it was my task to keep up with him and to follow him and to pray for him and do whatever I have to do. He didn't pay much attention to me in those days. So finally, I'm away from the church, became the executive director of the NAACP in Chicago. All right. So he gets elected to Congress, and we have this legislative arm of the NAACP, the Washington Bureau, there. And when he was having trouble with Strom Thurmond, of all folk, in those days, who was the head of the Senate Judiciary Committee. And we were trying to get the voting rights bill, and it remains a bill. We need to get that into a law. We really do. And so we had to organize and lobby and do all those kind of things through the legislative arm of the NAACP. So I got to know him real well. I said to him, I said, listen, and now I am a pastor at heart. I'm doing this wonderful work with NAACP and having a ball doing it, but I'm getting ready to go back to church. He said, where are you going? I said, to Progressive Community Church, 48th and Wabash, 3rd Ward. He said, I grew up there. He said, I know exactly the church. I said, yeah. He said, as a matter of fact, an aunt of mine was a member of that church. And when I was a boy, we shot marbles there in the alley near the church. I said, marbles?
Yeah, right.
The craps, man. He was shooting craps in there. But anyway, so that's the way the relationships developed. So when I was being invested into office at the church, in those days, Jane Byrne was running for mayor of the city. And Jane Byrne was doing things like giving money to black pastors and black churches, for the vote. You know how they play that game.
I was keeping the podcast clean, but I know exactly what she was doing. Yeah.
Okay, we're doing it. So at the investiture service, since I'm involved out there with everybody, I invite everybody to the party. All right, to the investiture service. I mean, I had enemies in there together. I had Lou Palmer and his crew on one side. I had the black nationalists up in there. I had, all kinds of folks in there. And so Jane Byrne is invited, and she is going to give the opening greetings, and she stands up and she gives these greetings. Okay, you have this whole array now of other politicians, including Harold on the rostrum with me. Mayor Byrne stands and she gives her greetings, and then she says, it's been a hard winter, and your choir probably need new robes, and so I'm going to donate $5,000. And my poor people just went up. Oh, yeah. Oh, wonderful. And I lean over and say, Harold, man, listen. I said, what you going to do, guy? And he said, what? I said, what are you going to do? I said, she just, upstaged us, man. And he said, man, I don't have $5,000 to give you. But I tell you what he did. When he made his remarks, he said to the whole house, I make Progressive Community Church my home church. Boom. So Jane Byrne had gone on,
right.
And Harold now had the people.
What is membership cost at the church?
$5,000.
Nothing like inflation.
But anyway, that's how it basically.
That's how you got a congregant, that way.
Right. And he owned me as his pastor. I owned him as my mayor.
Do you come in regularly and meet with him?
Often. Especially.
At his request, come in and talk?
Yeah, we had, especially phone conversations were easier early in the morning because he was an early riser like I am. And I'd call him and we'd get the day started. I'd give him a word of prayer, I'd give him a scripture, something to help him to focus for the day. I had done that the morning that he decided to create this council wars thing. And so.
He decided to create it?
Yeah, let me tell you what happened, man.
You don't think it came his way? He took up the he
didn't back off from the war,
that's
the
right.
fight.
Okay.
Yeah, all right. He knew it was going to be a battle.
Right.
So we had prayed that morning, and I said, I'm going to join you. I'm going to come to the council. I'm going to open this wonderful prayer for unity and peace and so forth. And man, okay, I'm done with the prayer. He calls the session to order and hits the desk and said, adjourn. And all hell broke loose. And he walks off.
He may say, that's why you got to know the rules.
He walks off, man, and I follow him. I said, man, what you doing? He said, come on with me. I said, I didn't know you were going to start a whole war. And that's how that piece went. But I was with him in some very tough spots. Yeah, praying with him.
So I feel weird saying this because we have this lightning round. And I'm going to do this. Are you for the Cubs or the Sox?
You know,
please, Dr. Burton. You are my rabbi, Dr. Martin, but please.
You know, I'm a South Sider.
Okay, so go ahead and say it.
Okay, I'm a South Sider.
Go ahead and say it.
But I like the Cubs as well.
Oh, no, you can't do that. I'm going to answer that for you. That was a Chicago White Sox answer.
I am a White Sox guy.
Thick or thin pizza?
I like, now there's again, I like vegetarian deep dish.
What?
Yes, I like a vegetarian deep dish pizza.
Is that answer allowed? That answer is not allowed. All right, we'll let it pass. It's kind of like, that's the closest to a hybrid I've heard yet. All right.
And it has to come from Connie's.
Connie's? Okay, that's good.
Yeah, okay.
The Hancock or the Sears?
Hancock.
Now that one you can explain why. I'm for it, but why?
Dr. Martin E. Marty, a mentor of mine, lives on the 84th.
Oh, okay. So you got a personal
attachment to it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. The Chicago Lake or the Chicago River?
Chicago Lake, man. And nothing like the Lake Perch.
Okay.
Nothing like the Lake Perch. I go as often as I can.
Okay. 16-inch softball or 12-inch?
16.
You pass. Not bad for somebody from Mississippi.
Hey, we didn't even play the game.
We are joined by Dr. B. Herbert Martin, who ministering for Harold Washington, but also, I'll be less than honest if I didn't also share this, has been a important spiritual voice for me. And I want you to know, unless you sit in that chair over next door, nobody knows how important that can be in keeping you balanced. And I want to thank you for that personally. And you have a book in you. And the cool thing about your book is I love reading books, as you probably know.
All right.
But on your book, I'm going to listen to it on audio. It is going to be really cool, man, because you got the greatest sounding voice I've ever. So I'm looking forward to. You're going to write this book because when you leave, I'm getting you an agent. I'm taking on the responsibility to get everything set for you.
I'll do it.
All right, deal.
Thank you,
Perfect.
Mayor.
Thank you.
Mayor.
Thank you for reminding us and keeping us whole as we get to this anniversary.
You've been listening to Chicago Stories with Mayor Rahm Emanuel. You can subscribe and leave a review on Apple Podcasts and tweet your guest ideas using hashtag ShyStories. Thanks for listening.